It's difficult to pick what we're going to talk about because so much is going on. I know that you've seen this. Oracle has been hacked. Apparently, the threat actor says yes. They've made records disclosure. Oracle says no. It's pretty much been proven that it's yes. Iranian ship communications were hacked, right? And they say that those ships were supplying munitions to Houthis. Speaking of the Houthis, how about war planning on Signal with a journalist in the chat? That was great. New York City is sending drones to 911 calls. Privacy advocates really don't like that. Veeam backup servers are under active exploit. Phishing as a service is ramped way up, and fake toll payment texts are everywhere. In fact, they're right here on this phone.
Yeah, well, I can tell you, my wife came running in about a week ago before it kind of hit the news, terrified that her license was going to be suspended or whatever the heck was in that thing. And I had to literally log into Good to Go, which is our version of toll pay here, and show her that no, I have an account. You're in the account. No, this is not you. And then finally she erased it. But very effective, obviously.
Yeah, they are effective. It's, if you know what to look for, it's haha, I see what this is. All right, well, if you get the InfoSec Insider Daily News Blast, you already know all of this. But that's all the stuff we're not going to talk about. I wish we could, but let's talk about healthcare for a bit because this came up yesterday. This is interesting. The Office of Civil Rights, right, OCR, is launching a new round of HIPAA compliance audits. They're focusing on the parts of the HIPAA security rule that correlate with preventing ransomware and other incidents. So what types of organizations do you think are in the sites, and what kind of advice should we be giving people?
Yeah. So, yeah, we know that there's 50 targets are going to be part of this, and it's going to be a mix like the 2016, 2017 round of audits where they could be going to include some business associates, right? They're
Yep.
not going to get a free pass on this. But they really are not saying anything, as far as I can tell, about who their targets are, or as they have said, we're going to look at specific requirements, right? So what might those be? So the first question, who are they going after? Some might say the segment that's most at risk, which might be rural healthcare.
Yeah.
I find that to be probably counterproductive because taking 6 weeks out of a staff of one that's running security at a hospital is
Yeah.
not a good idea to go through an audit. I certainly think that helping them is good, but an audit I don't think is the way to do it. But then there's what are they actually going to look at? They say it's not everything. So my feelings are going to be they're certainly going to look at are users getting training, right? I mean the
Of
basics, right?
course.
If you're not doing that, what's the other basic? Are you patching stuff? And are you patching stuff that's at high risk, like things that are on an edge device or exposed to the internet? So I think you bookend those two, and I think in the middle of that is going to be some form of either looking at multi-factor authentication. Maybe they're going to finally say, hey, looking once a quarter to see if the appropriate people are accessing records is not often enough. Or the other two are encryption, because we know that a lot of organizations, because it's an addressable requirement in HIPAA, still are arguing that they don't have to do it. I think that's an incorrect
Crazy.
interpretation. But yeah, crazy, and certainly a risky thing to do. And then backup systems, right? I think there's this understanding now that rapid recovery is a key, right? And if you can't do that, if you can't get back online quickly, you have issues. And we looked at Change Healthcare, and while it was the scope of that was 6 months, right? So I think these problems are become very obvious, and they're going to try to find ways to go out there and address those. So I'd suggest train your users, use a password vault. I know Mike used like to say prohibit password storage in browsers. I
Yes,
always
I
like to
do.
point out though that virtually every password vault product has had a breach, and none of the browser password vaults have ever been breached. Just a little piece of
Uh,
empirical evidence there.
Okay, big counterpoint. Info
Yeah.
stealers. If you haven't patched your browser, you can hit something that's an info stealer, and boop, all those credentials are gone. Okay, so I
Uh,
don't, I don't, I don't trust browsers. That's,
Fair enough. Fair enough.
yeah,
And use MFA, folks. Again, it's everywhere that it's needed. It's not just on the VPN. It's got to be software as a service you're using. It's got to be anytime you're using elevated privileges, not just admin. If you're a backup administrator, for Pete's sake, MFA, because that's the first place the bad guys are going to go to poison your backups, right? And patching, right? We all know how critical that is. Get
That's the
out there
hardest
and
part.
patch.
That's the
So,
hardest part.
what about you, Mike? How are you seeing
Well,
this?
so I think you're right, right? Credential abuse, social engineering, phishing, right? Being resistant to that, train your users, vulnerability exploit. Those are the top three methods that are used to gain initial access. But the litany that you just went through is pretty much aligned with the CPGs, right? The cybersecurity performance goals, which is kind of a reduced set of requirements to meet. So I think you're right. I also think that, the regulatory action, you brought up like rural, okay? They can't stand 6 weeks, to go through an audit, right? But regulatory action against healthcare facilities in general, and especially rural ones, right? If they get like fined because they're not doing all the stuff they should do, that might be the last straw that puts them up for sale and out of business. And it's interesting that that might happen because another article this week says that private equity backed healthcare has systemic issues with cyber preparedness, right? Which I think says more about private equity than it does about healthcare. And frankly, if you're private equity picking up hospitals in a fire sale, you might want to talk to us about how to avoid stepping on that landmine. Your holdings, right? Because of this, you have systemic problems. That might be what OCR is going after with these new audits, right? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Enough healthcare for the time being. We will come back. But I want to move on. The executive order that everyone wants to talk about. I had like 3 PR requests last week who wanted to talk about this. Um, responsibility for disaster management and critical infrastructure protection now on state and local government. It's not going to be the feds. The feds are backing off. Now, I don't know what this means about the future of FEMA because FEMA, as emergency management organization at the federal level, they do a lot of things besides respond to disasters. They also handle lots of grant funding, and if we're going to get all these responsibilities and there's no funding to come with that, and FEMA's not going to work properly, none of that's going to work. So, what do you think?
Yeah. So I always have to go back to the one thing that it bugs me about this, and that is putting wildfires, hurricanes, natural disasters, which are local national events, in
Hmm.
the same bucket as cyber attacks, which is by and large nation state, right? So it doesn't make sense, right, to put something where you're dealing with local issues to protect yourself against nation states. And I really have a hard time with the thought of Iowa now having to put up a cyber defense against North Korea, Russia,
Yeah.
China, and same thing for Rhode Island, and the same thing for right. It doesn't make much sense that we're going to create these, national defense islands around every state. So that's a problem. But there are some things I think are right about what they're talking about, and it's move from the all hazards approach, which has its place in a world where money is no issue, to a risk-based approach, right? In other words,
I agree with that too. Hmm.
yeah, I mean, we got to spend our money in the place where it's most important, and to be honest, this is kind of goes against regulatory compliance, where we are complying with everything in a standard, when in fact we should be focusing on the things that are important. Ironically, we tried that with HIPAA, the only risk-based standard with the addressable and required elements, and it didn't work because people really never applied it in the appropriate way. It was very haphazard in the way people did that. So I think the conceptually, again, this is a very good idea. But again, I get scared when I get to the implementation because the wording in the executive order is very vague on actually who owns these things. It's like, hey, we're not doing this anymore. Here's this list of agencies and standards and policies that we're no longer going to enforce,
That you have to.
that you have to somehow.
Yeah.
And they're not saying it goes away. They're saying it's yours now, right? And
Yeah.
are they going to audit people against, here's our list of what we did, are you doing what we did? There's kind of, it looks a little punitive when you look at the actual responsibilities component. I mean, it doesn't say they're going to do something, but it implies that if you don't do it, you're not upholding your end of this executive order.
But if
Um,
it doesn't come with funding, they can't withhold funding, right? So
yeah, that's always that we always go back to the, hey, that money that you were spending, U.S. government, are you going to give it back to the states so they can spend it on theirs? The answer is unfortunately no, as far as we know. And then the other kind of third wheel on this is election security, right? Again, this is something we're not really moving anything of security away from the states. The states are already doing election security at the local level, right? It's a state managed process with systems and machines or ballots that are all managed by the state. What they were doing at a national level was countering disinformation. And I want to make sure everybody realizes this is utterly not a partisan issue. Both sides will pay entities to distribute disinformation. It's not one side or the other. We're not stopping one side or the other from doing something. Everybody's doing it. And that's what we were doing, was combating these Nigerian and Russian disinformation farms, right? And like saying, no, you cannot vote. That polling station has been closed, when in fact it's open and you should be walking down there to cast your ballot. So again, we're mixing federal external things with states' rights, states' responsibilities things, and I will say it can only end poorly, in my opinion.
yeah, and so I agree with you that an all hazards approach is not something that is the right way to look at this. If you're not FEMA, right? FEMA is worried about Mount Rainier, the volcano going off, right? Or the 9.0 earthquake and the hurricanes and the wildfires, all that stuff, right? I get that that should be at the federal level. It's really tough for the state of Washington to plan for what are we going to do if Mount Rainier blows? Okay, the city of Tacoma is built on the mud flow from the last eruption. It's not gonna be pretty. Um, you know, Getting to the election security thing, and disinformation, what we lost is the ability to counter foreign disinformation, right? That's specifically what they were
Yes.
about. It wasn't domestic. Like politicians lie all the time. We just know that, right? But foreign disinformation, and now every country in the world has a dog in this fight. And so we are just going to be pelted with this stuff. And 60% of Americans get their news from social media, right? They read memes, they think it's the news, and this is what's dragging us down. And so, this is from my perspective, they just exacerbated that problem. So we're going to
Yeah.
have to find out. And I'll say this too, the things that we are losing from CISA, if all this goes on to the states, right? Free risk assessments, perimeter scanning, known exploitable vulnerabilities catalog, national cybersecurity review, monitoring, network monitoring at election time of precincts, okay? All gone, right? And we're going to have to recreate all that stuff ourselves. And some states are already doing this. So New York, in particular, their Department of Financial Services, they have, and also their analog to Health and Human Services, they have created requirements for their banks, their finance sector, and their healthcare sector that's very much like the federal statutes, but they are insulated from all of the dysfunction of Congress. You're regulated, you're not, you are, you're not. And so that's what I think states are going to do. I mean, they're going to have to compensate for that. The last thing I'll say about this is when the EPA, as the sector risk management agency for the water sector, went out and said, we want everybody to do a cyber risk assessment and turn that in along with your sanitary survey that you have to do anyway. 3 states sued because it was an unfunded mandate. Okay, what's this if not an unfunded mandate? All right, so I don't think this is going to end the way FedGov thinks it's going to end. I think there's going to be lawsuits. I mean, there's like any number of lawsuits right now. All right, well, look, we'll come back to this because this is going to end up being a fist fight between states and the federal government. Buy some popcorn. All right. It, this story should surprise no one. I think it's interesting that it's being documented by the intelligence community, or at least the intelligence community from the EU, right? Nation states and criminals are colluding to make espionage look like crime. How much does that surprise you, Fred?
None, zero. As a matter of
Yeah.
fact, it leads to exactly what we're complaining about in the previous discussion about the executive order. So,
Yeah, right. I don't know what to say about that. I I do think criminals are better at what they do than government hackers. So, you know, and maybe it's because they're making so much money and they get really good at it. I don't know, but you're right. Going back to the previous article, the U.S. government is not helping by making less capable organizations, states and local governments, responsible for fighting this battle because you're going up against countries. You're not going to win. Hospital, bank, city, county, you're not going to win.
Yeah,
And, you know, and frankly, when criminals are hired, co-opted, whatever you want to call it, they target organizations that, when they are disrupted, they satisfy the strategic goals of Russia, right? Which is destabilizing the U.S. way of life. And so now, Russia's got the black belts doing this. They have them going after targets that are destabilizing, and that gives them plausible deniability. This was not an act of war. These are just criminals.
exactly. Well,
Yeah.
that's the thing. One of the things that also was somewhat surprising is apparently we suspended any external offensive cyber operations for the U.S.
We did. We
Yeah,
didn't.
we
We
did. We
fired him.
didn't.
We hired him back.
Right,
Let's go on.
but what are you seeing? We're moving away from where the rest of the entire world is going, where they're, I don't know if you call it co-opting or how you want to put it, but they're colluding with, if you will, their criminal organizations as long as they're committing crimes against other nation states. Uh, Again, we're at a huge disadvantage, and I'm not suggesting that we align with cybercrime, but the states are going to pick up. I just, again, we're breaking down the infrastructure that the rest of the world is building up. Again, I don't see how this can end well for us.
This is why we need to treat our logical border like a physical border and enforce a standard of behavior on this side. And if you don't meet it, we start progressively turning off everything coming from your country, right up to and including your banks, right? And let them go howl at the president, right? All right, we got to get out of here. I got to lighten the tone here. Uh, so way to go, Cloudflare. All right. I don't know if you saw this, because they have some of the best telemetry on the planet, right? They see the crawling going on by AI bots that are scooping up everything to train models. And apparently this pissed them off a little bit. And so when they detect this stuff, they don't block it. They link to a bunch of AI generated BS pages to waste the time and the resources of the crawler. So way to go, Cloudflare. But that probably means that some AI models are spitting out that BS thinking that it was all real data. And I'm sure that won't come back to bite anyone, right? All right, okay. All right, we got to get out of here. Sign up for the InfoSec Insider News Blast. Come to free security awareness training. Watch the Lumify site for events coming up because they're coming up. All right, you ready to go back to work?
Ready to go. Thanks, Mike.
All right. See you, Fred.